Margaret Thatcher exploded the feminist myth by proving that a woman can be strong, smart, conservative, and feminine all at the same time. And I personally am lucky to work at an institute where many in the leadership, among the staff, and among our supporters personify those qualities of Margaret Thatcher. We're very lucky to have with us today John Blundell to talk to us about Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady.
Well, you've made half my speech for me, Clint. There's still spinsters in their early 40s, mid-40s in London who remember your sabbatical. Part of what I do these days, as well as writing books and speaking, and is a bit consulting for state-based policy think tanks. And I can tell you that the Goldwater Institute is regarded as being among the elite. There are three that always get mentioned when I'm making my visits. There's Goldwater, there's Mackinac up in Midland, Michigan, and there's the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Those three are setting the standards that all the other 47 want to emulate. So my second visit here, in fact, there's a gentleman here who remembers my first visit, who came up and introduced himself. I can't quite see him. But I was here about 1988 or 89, when you just opened your doors. In fact, you maybe didn't even have an office. So I seem to recall addressing the Goldwater Institute breakfast at the Camelback Inn. And then that evening, a gentleman, some of you might remember, Chet Anderson, had me address his economics discussion club. And another gentleman, Harry Hoyles, the late Harry Hoyles was my guide that day. So it's so great to be back. Now you might wonder, how come this British economist has turned to writing books about women? Because I've not just written my book about Margaret Thatcher, there's also a flyer out of your chair for my new book, Ladies for Liberty, Women Who Made a Difference in American History. And it came about through Bridget Wagner of the Heritage Foundation, who about 6 years ago in Colorado Springs asked me to address the Heritage Resource Bank about Margaret Thatcher. And I did, and I got such a fantastic response that I thought, I've got to write this up, I've got to make this into a book, explaining directly to foreigners, not to English people, but to people overseas. And in fact, my Margaret Thatcher book is now in Polish, and soon to be in Romanian and Chinese. This book, Margaret Thatcher, Portrait of the Iron Lady, then got me on the road again, speaking about her. And I'd get somewhat annoyed that it seemed everywhere I went, somebody in the audience would get up, and the second or third comment from the floor would be, why haven't we had a Margaret Thatcher in our history? And I'd say, well, wait a minute, American history is stuffed with great women. You've got more great women in your history than in any other history in the world. And I'd rattle off a few names, and of course everybody would know Abigail Adams and Martha Washington and Harriet Beecher Stowe, say, and Ayn Rand. But after that, when I got talking about people like Bina Westmiller or Mercy Otis Warren or the Grimke sisters, names like that, recognition just went into the cellar. About 3 years ago, I was sitting in a Chinese takeout in Port Charlotte, Florida, with my then 19-year-old. And you know how respectful 19-year-olds can be to their parents. And my 19-year-old James, listening to me banging on again about this lack of knowledge of all these great women, turned to me and said, for heaven's sakes, Dad, shut up, stop moaning and write a book about them all. And that's this book, which is saying, there's a flyer on each, we don't have them for sale today, but there is a flyer on your... Now what about Margaret Thatcher? She was born in the mid-1920s in a small market town of Grantham, Lincolnshire, on the eastern side of the United Kingdom. Self-employment dominates her family tree on both sides as far back as it can be traced. She was the second daughter of a man called Alf Roberts, so she grew up as Margaret Roberts, and he ran the local grocer's shop. and he ended up with 2 shops at one point. He was a pillar of the community. He held every conceivable civic post, from councilman to alderman to mayor, and during World War II was even an air raid precaution warden. He left school at age 12, but was known as the most learned man in town. And every week, she and Alf would go to the local library and come back with arms full of books, and dozens of books littered the house. Adult conversation was at all meals was what she grew up with. No kiddie talk. It was always about adult topics. And she grew up with no bath, no running hot water, no TV or no radio. At the movie house in the town opened her eyes to the outside world, and her favourite movie of the 1930s was Jimmy Stewart in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. In the start of World War II, or in the middle of World War II, rather, the United States Air Force bases came to Lincolnshire, the county, for 2 reasons. A, it was flat, so it was very easy to build, and second, the eastern side of England, of course, is closest to the continent, so the bombers could make deeper flights over enemy territory. But this led to a public policy problem, because some of the servicemen had Sundays off. And back then, everything closed on Sundays, even the parks. The gates of the parks would be closed and bolted, locked. Everything was closed. So what could these servicemen do on their when they rotated off on a Sunday? And Alf was struggling with this over dinner. And should he open the park so he could throw around the football, or should he let the movie house open so that they could go watch a movie? In the end, he decided on the movie house. He decided it would be less disruptive to the Sabbath than a bunch of young Americans throwing balls around parks. She walked to school, and in the 30s would have walked by the dole queues, and in the early mid-40s by the bomb damage, because although it was a small market town, it happened to have a munitions factory, which the Germans regularly targeted, and so they were regularly bombed. She skipped a year in grade school, and she aimed for chemistry at Oxford. Now there's a huge reach. I mean, A, chemistry back then was, a boys' subject, and B, Oxford. It'd be like somebody from Podunk going to Harvard. It'd be like a grocer's daughter in Podunk going to Harvard or Yale, to an Ivy League school. It was an enormous reach. In those days, you needed Latin to study chemistry. Heaven knows why. And of course, girls' school didn't teach Latin. The boys' school did, and so Alf dipped into his savings and hired the Latin teacher from the boys' school to teach Margaret in the evenings and weekends. And she did 7 years of Latin in 6 months, as well as keeping up with other studies. She got in, age 17, did a 4-year degree in chemistry. She volunteered 2 nights a week at bussing tables at a United States Air Force base near to her university. The Union, the Oxford Union, the famous debating club, was closed to women until the mid-60s. They could sit up with the gods and watch, but they couldn't participate. And she wasn't going to have any of that. So she threw herself into the Oxford University Conservative Association and became its 2nd ever lady president. But the first on merit, the lady who just beat her had a dad who was in the cabinet and who could provide lots of good speakers. But she was the first to do it purely on merit. She got a job in industry. She was involved in developing, I don't know what you call it, that stuff that comes in a can and it's white, and you press it, it's like cream.
Whipped cream.
Yeah, she was involved in developing that. She was adopted in her early 20s, early mid-20s, for the safe socialist seat of Dartford in Kent, just southeast of England. And she fought that in 1950 and 51, not getting in, of course, but taking big chunks of the socialist vote. A local businessman there was called Dennis Thatcher. They met, he proposed, and they married. She had twins, Mark and Carol, and it was whilst she was recovering in hospital from giving birth to the twins that she decided to switch from being a chemist to being an attorney, and signed the papers, and quickly qualified as an attorney. In the late 50s, now practicing, she started off at the patent bar where she thought a chemist training would be useful, but there wasn't enough work, and so she switched to the tax bar. which was quite a hard place to practice. But in the late 50s, she decided she deserved a safe seat, having fought a socialist seat twice, and she kept applying and applying and applying, and she kept coming second. Every time she came second. And it was the women who didn't want her. The women in the Conservative associations, on the selection committees, wanted, you know, a nice young man who'd had a good war, a few medals on his chest, a pretty wife that stayed home looking after their 2.6 children, and not this rather pushy chemist turned accountant who had, because her husband was quite wealthy, who had the means to hire nannies and go out to work. This is not what they wanted, but eventually she just squeaked it through by about 2 votes in Finchley in North London, and represented Finchley from 1959 to 1992 when she took her seat in the House of Lords. And from then on, being a woman probably helped her, because there weren't many women in politics, particularly in the Conservative Party, and there was always a thought that you have to have your statutory woman. When Ted Heath won in 1970, we now know that he rang his friend Geoffrey Rippon and said, well, Geoffrey, who's going to be our statutory woman? And Geoffrey said, well, why don't we make Margaret the Education Minister? After all, she's got a science degree, and science policy in England comes under the Education Department. And he said, well, I suppose so. And then he parked her down the end of the table where he couldn't see her. Because the cabinet table it's a very long, thin table with about 12 people on each side. The Prime Minister doesn't sit at the head, he sits halfway down one side. So you can see everybody on that side quite easily, and you can see a couple of people either side here. But if you park Margaret down there, there's no way she's going to go in edgeways. Second, what was the state of the UK when she won? 1979 was called the Winter of Discontent, as in the opening lines of William Shakespeare's Richard III, now is the winter of our discontent. We'd had double-digit inflation for 6 years, gas supplies were disrupted, there were pickets all over the place, 1 million people got laid off, ambulances stopped responding to 911 calls. Can you imagine that? No 911 calls. There were mountains of trash everywhere, literally 30, 40 foot high mountains of trash, because the trashmen were on strike. The grave diggers went on strike, and so the government had to organise these empty factories which filled up with coffins, and the chief medical officer was about to order a mass burial at sea of all these thousands of coffins when they went back to work. There were food shortages. There were hospital union leaders deciding who to admit to hospital, not doctors. And if people died, as one union leader famously put it, so be it. Trolleys of food being delivered to old people's home were smashed by pickets, and British Rail issued probably the shortest press release in the history of journalism. It had 5 words and about 20 letters. There are no trains today. There was actually a press release put out, there are no trains today. She became the 4th ever elected lady leader after Mrs. Bandaranaike in Sri Lanka, Mrs. Gandhi in India, and Mrs. Mayer in Israel, had all been elected back in the 60s, but she was the first in the West. She inherited an economy that was ranked 19th out of 22 in the OECD. The French ambassador had said that our economy was suffering from dégringolade. Does anybody know what dégringolade is? It's French for falling down sickness. And Germany wasn't reunified at that point, and the West German ambassador said we had the economy of East Germany. Pretty bad that. So what did she do? In my book I have 10 bullet points to summarise, and Clint's already pretty much done this for me, but I'll do it again just to drive the lesson home. She took on the whole trade union movement and brought it back under the rule of law, thus taking it away, its leadership away from the extremists and giving it back to the ordinary members. She transformed the nation's view of the benefits of a market economy. She privatised the commanding heights of the economy, about 60 or 70 privatizations, of which about 20 were really very, very, very big ones. And this transformed their fortunes, turned them from subsidy-seeking into tax-paying entities, and started a worldwide movement that continues to this day. She taught us the need for monetary continence if we wish to enjoy low inflation. She enfranchised millions of local authority serfs through giving them the right to buy their unit of public housing from the state. She made Brits walk tall again with a firm, strong, principled, international rule of law-based approach to foreign relations. She cut marginal tax rates from the 90s to the 80s down to the 60s and then the 40s. That in turn stopped the fame and drain and the brain and drain of people leaving the country. In fact, people started returning. She used to have parties at 10 Downing Street, and you know the famous movie actor Michael Caine? He returned. He left England for Hollywood, not because he was making so many Hollywood films, but just for tax reasons. He came back, and she would always invite him to parties at 10 Downing Street. And when he came in, she would grab him by the arm and walk around the room with Michael, saying to people as if he needed any introduction, "This is Michael, he came back." She started the process which has now led to peace in Northern Ireland. She helped Ronald Reagan tear down that wall without a shot being fired and thus destroying the evil empire. And she ensured that all future British governments had to be much more friendly toward the ideas of the free market economics if they want to succeed. So what were the results? I call Thatcherism, because there was no such thing as Majorism. John Major was just sort of Margaret Thatcher in second gear. So I really said that Margaret Thatcher isn't the 11 years she was in power, it's 11 plus 7. It's the 18 years from 79 to 97. So all of my figures I'm going to give you now are comparing 79 and 97. In 18 years, we jumped from 19th to 2nd in the OECD ladder. And we've become a nation of entrepreneurs. I think self-employment is a very good guide to the level of entrepreneurship in a society. And the number of self-employed in our workforce had jumped from 7% to 14%. When she came to power in 79, we had no venture capital industry. We had zero venture capital. Just halfway into Margaret's 11 years, so 5.5 years later, the British venture capital industry was twice the size of the entire continental venture capital industry. The socio-economic group we call the middle class jumped from 33% to 50% of the population. Home ownership, as opposed to renting privately, renting from the government or tied housing, home ownership leapt from 53% to 71%. Ownership of shares went from, by individuals, and this is owning individual shares, not ownership in a pension fund and you know a clue where the pension fund manager is buying, but where you decide, you pick a firm, and you decide, I'm going to own shares in that firm, jumped from less than 10% of the population to nearly 30%. And share ownership became such a big deal that the BBC, you probably think that stands for British Broadcasting Corporation. In my household, it stands for Big Bunch of Communists. The BBC had like a half-time the business reporter. It was only like half his job, but people became so interested in share ownership and home ownership and so on and so forth that the BBC had a whole raft of reporters to cover all these topics that people were now very interested in. Membership of a trade union. When she came to power, over 50% of us belonged to a union. By the time Major left power, it was less than 20%. Strikes, days lost to strike. The strikes plummeted. When she came to power, we were losing something like 30 million days a year to strikes. When Major left power, that figure was less than 500,000. Can anybody guess which industry that 500,000 was in? Post office. She failed. She failed to privatise the post office. And the big story was that because she met weekly with the Queen, was that the Queen was very disturbed at the thought of the not having her picture at every stamp. And so post office is slowly, of course, just as in this country, falling apart. So what are the 10 lessons? I have a chapter toward the end of my book on the 10 lessons that we can learn from Thatcher and that we might find useful, even apply today. She had a very strong personal, moral, political compass. You knew where you stood. She had these very firm ideas, the kind of ideas that people here at the Goldwater Institute stand for, and ministers knew that. And ministers knew instinctively how to approach problems if they wanted to stay in her good books. She was very brave as well. Very early on in her prime ministership, there was the Iranian embassy siege in central London that some of you might remember, where 26 hostages were taken. And after about 5 days, one of them was shot and the body thrown out the door, at which point obviously negotiations had broken down. And Margaret just said, "Go in," to the troops. And they went in and they took out all the terrorists. I think all but one got killed and no more hostages were harmed. And she visited the troops that evening just north of London at their base, and the commanding officer said, "We were prepared all the time, Prime Minister, but in our heart of hearts we never thought we'd see a British Prime Minister give such a clear, direct instruction in such a positive one." Second, she was able to cut through all the guff and the nonsense. I often find that really clever people are often not very good at expressing their ideas. Margaret was the opposite. She was a bit like Newt Gingrich. Newt and Margaret would never say, "at this moment in time," they would say, "now." Short Anglo-Saxon words, making it very clear. My friend Simon Jenkins once interviewed Margaret, and he said something to her about her laissez-faire policies, and she said, "Simon, laissez-faire? Laissez-faire? Don't you go French on me." She did lead, and thirdly, she led, and she expected an awful lot out of people around her. I'm going to tell you 2 stories now. The first one's true, the second one's not true, but we'll discuss it. Many of my friends became MPs, 2 of them, one in 1983, Michael, and one in 1987, David. By the time David had become an MP in 1987, Michael was already a junior minister, I think in the Scottish office. On David's first day in Parliament, he's walking through the members' lobby, which is just off the central lobby, and Michael goes running through, briefcase and papers, his hair all over the place, and David called out to Michael, "Slow down, Rome wasn't built in a day." And as Michael disappeared down the corridor, he shouted back over his shoulder, "Yes, but Margaret wasn't the foreman on that job." The next is not true, but it illustrates how people viewed her. The story goes, as I said, there's not a germ of truth in this, but this is the story. But, on the 10th anniversary of her becoming Prime Minister, ministers and the senior civil servants took her to dinner at the Café Royal, central London, the private room upstairs there. And she's sitting at the head of the table, and there's about 20 men in suits down each side. And the waiter comes in, and he approaches the Prime Minister, and he says, "Prime Minister, would you like an appetizer?" "Let's have a prawn cocktail, please." "Prime Minister, for your main course, I'll have a steak, please." "Prime Minister, what kind of steak?" "Sirloin, please." "Prime Minister, how would you like your steak?" "Rare, please." Prime Minister, some potatoes? Yes, roasted potatoes, please. Prime Minister, what about the vegetables? Oh, they'll all have steak too. It really wasn't like that, I can assure you. Although the noun handbag became a verb, as it to be handbagged, as it to be hit over the head with the Thatcher handbag. It became very much the in thing for Conservative Party constituency chairman when they were having their big annual fundraiser to ask Margaret if she should donate a handbag that they could auction off. And these handbags used to go for thousands of pounds. She wasn't like that though. She did agonise. She wondered over this idea of letting local authority tenants buy their units of public housing at up to 50% off. She thought that might really irk the great British middle class who'd scrimped and saved and paid full price. It didn't, as it turned out. People took the view that these people had been paying rent for donkey's years, and they'd probably do a much better job of looking after their homes. And in fact, the first thing they did when they, I maybe even took you to see, I can't remember, is the first thing they did was they replaced the government-issued metal door with a nice wooden door, and the second thing was they replaced the nasty metal window frames with nicer frames. And so you could instantly tell. I certainly took many Americans to public housing estates in London and played a game of, which one's private and which one's not. And, everybody scores 100% every time. But she agonised about it. She also agonised over some of the big privatisations. I mean, after all, they were giant privatisations. Electricity, water, gas, British Airways, the National Freight Corporation, and about 15 others. But they learned how to do those, and they went well. Fourthly, she championed policies that went with the grain of human nature, not against, such as giving staff in these nationalised industries huge discounts on the shares. They would reserve, I remember the BA, when it was privatised, 20% of the shares were reserved for staff and given a huge discount. It was buying out those special interests by giving them a different interest. And of course, the selling of public housing very much went with the grain of human nature. There's a lot of strategic thinking well ahead of time. She became Tory party leader in 75 and had 4 years before she became Prime Minister in 79. I mean, you don't have that sort of gap. I mean, do you? You only have a few weeks. She had 4 years, and she used it very well. Sixth, she got a lot of very smart, dedicated people around her. The Tory party, when I first took my first lecture at the London School of Economics, it was compulsory to take politics, whatever your major. And I had Bernard Donahue in 1971, and he announced that the Tory party is the stupid party. And there was a lot of, there was a lot of truth to that. I mean, an awful lot of people were there because who their parents and grandparents were, not because they had any ideas or talents. And that was very much changing, and Margaret urged that wave of change on. And in Margaret's day, you basically got there on merit, not through your parents or grandparents. Seventh, there was very much a sense of being the last chance saloon. There was very much a sense that if we didn't do it this time, well, we probably were going to go, we were probably going to become the next Argentina, or whatever. I remember a newspaper headline in 1978, it was, cheer up, things are getting worse. The argument being that appetite for real radical change only comes when things are really bad. If you're muddling along and everybody's sort of reasonably happy, you're not going to have the appetite for change. Eighth, we mustn't forget the special relationship between President Reagan and Prime Minister Thatcher. It was very, very special in many ways. It was Dennis Thatcher who first spotted Ronald Reagan, not Margaret. Ronald Reagan came through London, I I guess in the mid-70s. When would he sit down as governor of California? 76, maybe? Somewhere around there.
66 to 70. Yes.
Mid-70s, and he gave a speech to the Institute of Directors, and Dennis, as a director of the company, was there, and he came running home to Margaret in their home and said, "Margaret, you've got to meet this man." And Reagan came through twice more before she became Prime Minister, and then of course a little later he became President. And both times an hour was scheduled, and both times they spent 3 hours. Both meetings ran over by 2 hours. And it was no accident that when he became President in 1980, she wasn't the first President or Prime Minister to visit him. She was the second, but the first was from some diddly squat little country. I forget which country. She was the first major visitor, and of course she reciprocated. They were so alike, it's uncanny. They both simply didn't believe, well, they didn't believe in communism, and they didn't believe in communist statistics. I, in researching my book, found the following quote, and it's the only book about Thatcher with this quote, which just stunned me. In 1950, when she was a candidate for Dartford, Kent, there was a big rally in Kent with all the, in a football stadium, with all the Conservative candidates of that county, and I think the shadow Foreign Secretary, the person who would become Foreign Secretary once the Conservatives won, which they did in 51. And Margaret was a bit of a warm-up speaker. And she said, "We believe in the democratic way of life. If we serve the idea faithfully, with tenacity of purpose, we have nothing to fear from Russian communism." In 1950. And I can remember in 1962 as a schoolboy being trained how to hide under my school desk, when the nukes came. In 1950, we've nothing. If we stick to principle, we've got nothing to fear from the communists. It's astonishing. She prepared. Well, many of the ideas to do with privatisation, reforming the unions, selling council homes, enterprise zones, were developed. And lastly, she didn't try to do it all at once. We had one big privatisation, maybe one medium-sized one and one small one every year. She didn't do the unions, the union reforms in one big act. She just shaved away. Every other year for 10 years, she cut into their legal immunities. So the lessons I list are: have a strong compass, simplify and communicate, lead but always listen, develop policies that go with the grain of human nature, think through your strategy ahead of time, build good teams, use circumstances, make good allies, prepare before you're in power, and have patience. So, how do we judge her? In my book, I say that if David Cameron, or actually he wasn't Prime Minister at that point, I said a future Prime Minister, what would a future Conservative Prime Minister have to do to equal today, or over the next 11 years, to equal their record? And I say that he or she would have to deregulate and stop the tsunami of new regulation coming out of Brussels. They'd have to renegotiate our treaty with Brussels to make it purely a trade matter, bring crime down, reform the National Health Service, increase educational standards, reduce the welfare rolls, simplify and reduce taxation, and balance the books. I said somebody did all that. Just give you a feel of the scale of what she did. They would have to do all of that to be her equal. Well, how do we rate her? Well, the institutionally left-leaning BBC, even they had to rank her quite high. They rank her as the 16th greatest Briton ever in all of history. 16th greatest ever. Charles Moore, one of our most distinguished journalists, recently wrote, "With all due respect to Her Majesty the Queen, Margaret Thatcher is the greatest living Englishwoman." And Francis Beckett, who's one of our leading historians, has just written a history of the 20 prime ministers of the 20th century. Very neat. We have 20 prime ministers in the 20th century. And he ranks them all. I'm sure you can all guess who comes in last.
Neville Chamberlain.
Yes.
Thank you.
Well said. Neville Chamberlain, of course. And I won't list them all out. John Major comes in the 18th. Tony Blair, 12th. Howard Wilson, 11th. I'll give you the top 5. Harold Macmillan, 5th. Sir Winston Churchill, 4th. Edward Heath, 3rd. Clement Attlee, 2nd. And Margaret Thatcher, 1st. So there she is, lying in 1st. And I'd be happy to sign copies of my book afterward out in the opposite the main door and dedicate them in any way that you'd like. I will tell you something about dedicating books. I had a big book signing in Washington, D.C. for my new book the other day. The other day, it was late October. And a lady came up and bought a copy, and she disappeared. And about half an hour later, she came back. She said, "I've just been sitting over there in the corner, there's a big reception, reading your book." She said, "It's really very good." She said, "I'd like to buy a copy for my friend Meryl Streep." I got to dedicate one of these. It's Meryl Streep. And I put to Meryl Streep, I hope you find some good movie ideas in my book. We've got 2 mics, I believe.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and take questions for the next about 15 minutes until 10 o'clock. So go ahead and raise your hands. And we have a funny policy where we don't let these microphones leave our hands. So it's like the first over in that neighborhood.
Well, you just mentioned Meryl Streep, so I have to ask the movie that's out, what is your take on that movie?
I think there's, for me, there was 2 issues going into it. Before I do, how many of you have seen the movie? Wow, that's about a third of you. You must be doing very well. I think for me, going into it, there were two issues. Firstly, is it right to portray a living person as having some sort of form of dementia? I went into the movie thinking, no, it's not right, and I came out thinking, well, wait a minute, I better rethink this, because Streep does an extraordinarily good job, which is why she got the Oscar, and she doesn't portray Margaret, well, she portrays Margaret from roughly age 45 to 65, and then to today at age 86, and another actress portrays Margaret age 16 to 30, so, and it's a whole series of flashbacks, Margaret stumbling around her home, confused, and getting these flashbacks. And I think the balance of the movie is incorrect. They should have had a lot more of the flashbacks and a lot less of the dementia. But having said that, I think 2 things. One, I think charities that work in that area probably will see a spike in donations. Secondly, I think it was okay to do it because when you enter public life, I mean, you cross a line, and the law about what you can say and what can be said about you even changes. And I think having crossed that line so spectacularly and for so long, I think it was okay. Also, she's not portrayed as being totally out of tune with life. And she has extraordinarily good moments, even as an 86-year-old. There's that scene toward the end, which is on YouTube. If you if you go to YouTube and put in the search engine Meryl Streep, Margaret Thatcher, fact or fiction, there's a 6-minute film of me talking about Margaret Thatcher, and then the people very cleverly put a few clips from the movie in, and there's a brilliant clip toward the end where Carol, who's very well played, Carol, the twin daughter, wants Mum to go to the doctor a month early for her annual checkup, and Margaret can't understand this, and she goes very reluctantly, And she's sitting there in the doctor's office, and the doctor's finished the physical exam, I guess, and he's going through a series of questions about her mental health. And she's clearly lying. She's clearly completely tuned in, and she's clearly lying. And then the phone rings, and the doctor ignores it. And it rings a second time, and the doctor ignores it. And Margaret fixes him with her famous stare, and she says, something like this. Don't you think you should pick that? Please pick up that phone. After all, it might be somebody who really needs your help. So she is. Now the other question is, does she come out with her reputation? Well, I went and think Hollywood would massacre her, kick her around, maybe be neutral. In my wildest dreams, maybe be a little positive, but of course not very positive. And I came out thinking that it was a little positive overall. I think if you can get by the fact that she's portrayed the way she's portrayed as an old lady, and see the good side of that, then I think overall she comes out of it quite well. They use a lot of actual newsreel, Trevor McDonald reading the news, and clips of, it was a very low budget, it was $10 million. So they use a lot of news clips. They don't overdo that. That's another danger, that they could have overdone that, rely too much on. And after all, it's not a documentary, you know, it's a movie. Now, I'm sure there's at least one gentleman in here, because he collared me earlier. I'm just looking for him, and I know he was very upset by the movie. Should we go to this lady in the back?
Can you speak to the three-way relationship between Margaret Thatcher, President Reagan, and Pope John Paul II?
Not really. I've spoken already about Reagan, and the importance there, and it was very, even the Queen, I think, liked Ronald Reagan. She had him stay at Windsor Castle, which is very rare, and they went horseback. So they had a big passion for horseback riding, the Queen and Ronald Reagan. And you have to remember that, of course, she started as Prime Minister when Jimmy Carter was in power. She met with Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter didn't like her one little bit. He complained in his memoirs that he couldn't get a word in edgeways. And then there was the 8 years of overlap with Reagan. And then, of course, she had a couple of years overlap with the first President Bush. And famously said to him, after the invasion of Kuwait, they were at the same conference together, weren't they, in Colorado, when that all broke out. And she supposedly rang him on the internal phone system in this resort, where they were at some G7 or G8 or whatever, and she said, "Don't you go wobbly on me, George." I'm not. There is a very good book about that relationship, the three-way relationship. I think by John O'Sullivan. I think he wrote a book called "The President, the Prime Minister, and the Pope." But that came out after I'd written my book. I mean, we all know the basic story, but I can't give you any insider detail.
A quick observation from some work we did with Mrs. Thatcher, but then a question. We did a live shot with her from the Biltmore some years ago, and when you do a live shot, you have to put a mic cable down your shirt that you're wearing. I'll just say she was most uninhibited with my audio technician, so she's iron in a variety of ways. And if anybody wants to know one-on-one, I'll tell you. The question is, and I know you're not her, but if Mrs. Thatcher and Barack Obama had coffee, what are 2 or 3 things she would say to him?
Well, I'm pretty sure she'd be more concerned about the healthcare reforms than about the deficit. Those would be the first 2 things they'd be talking about. But I think she would probably lead on health, because I mean, her experience was that she couldn't do anything to our National Health Service. And in fact, Labour kept saying, beating her over the head with their plans to privatise the National Health Service, which didn't actually exist. I mean, she might have thought about it, but they didn't exist as plans. And in the end, she was driven to say the National Health Service is safe in our hands. So if even though Margaret Thatcher can't reform something as evil as the National Health Service, then once you get it, you're stuck with it. I mean, it's basically over a 50-year period replaced the Church of England in the British psyche. So I think, well, if she was advising, let's turn your question around, if she was advising, say, Mitt Romney or an Ed Fulmer at Heritage, I think she would say, focus on health first and the economy second.
You maybe address how her own party turned against her, and what were some of those key issues, because she was treated rather shabbily on the way out, was she not?
Yes, she had become, well, after 15 years as party leader and 11 and a half years as Prime Minister, she made a lot of enemies. You know, a lot of people had felt, you know, they hadn't been promoted enough, people felt they'd been overlooked, sacked, or whatever, what have you. She never promoted a man with a beard. She thought men with beards couldn't be trusted. And the three senior men who had beards. There was also arguably the most brilliant man of his generation, Jonathan Aiken. And she didn't promote Jonathan for 15 years, even though he was clearly astonishingly able, because he dated Carol, and he dumped Carol, and Margaret came home and Carol was crying. The man that made Carol cry never got a job. She never brought another woman into cabinet. There was one woman for 1 year in cabinet with her, but that was out of her control. There's one slot in the cabinet that the Prime Minister doesn't control, and that is the leader of the House of Lords. And their lordships elected a woman for a year, and so Margaret had to have her in. And she probably parked to where Ted Heath. I don't know that that's a fact, but I bet she did. You know, Harold Wilson once said a week is a long time in politics. I mean, 15 years is an eon. And then she sort of made some injudicious remarks about how many years she planned to go on for. People were kind of blimey. And then she tried to reform the system of local taxation and remove it from the value of a property and attach it to how many people lived in the property as an index of how many local services you were consuming. Because if you have two identical properties, a single person in this property using no local services at all, pretty much, other than maybe the sidewalks and the roads, and it's a family of 6 consuming huge amounts, they paid the same tax, and she thought that was unfair. But when she tried to change that, that galvanised the left, and the Tories were doing very badly in the polls. Then she made a very unwise speech about Europe. That was, even for her, was a little extreme, and basically her deputy, Geoffrey Howe, resigned. And when you resign, you have, the Speaker calls you after about a week. If you're a senior minister who resigns, and you get to make a speech from the backbenches, and Geoffrey just savaged her. And that would have been all very well, and she'd have survived even that. But it was the week before, the 1 week a year, when nominations are open to challenge the leadership of the Tory party. And so Michael Heseltine, who she'd fallen out with, decided to take advantage of that 1 week, that opening. And she appointed a very bad campaign team, a very lazy bunch of men who thought she'd walk all over him, and they didn't do very much. And she didn't work the tea rooms or the bars, shaking hands and so on. And she went off to Paris. And she still won with about 65% of the vote. of the MPs. But the rules had changed, and you needed a supermajority. And she was 2 short of the supermajority. And she said, I'm going to fight on. But Dennis said, no, love, come on, pack it in. Let's go and have some time together. And her ministers all came one by one, telling her that, of course, Margaret, I support you, and I'll always support you, but we don't think you'll win on the second round. And it turned out they were all lying, but and they all had their own personal agendas. But she decided to go and throw her weight behind John Major as a successor, basically to stop Heseltine, who was a complete corporatist Keynesian. So she went to preserve her legacy, more than anything.
I have some relatives who are native Brits, and they tell me that they have private health insurance, and I think there's some deductions or some sort of tax encouragement in buying private health insurance, and that a lot of members of the British middle class now tend to go private and not take advantage of the National Health Service. Is that true? And if so, does that have anything to do with Margaret Thatcher's policies?
I can't think of anything she did directly to encourage that. It is true that private health has been growing. When I grew up in the 50s and 60s, it was extremely rare to hear of anybody with private coverage. I believe it was literally about 1 or 2%. It has become more popular, but it's still 12%, 15%, something like that, which of course is a huge jump. But it's still not at all widespread. You get some companies that offer it because they want their workers to get back to work, not have a 6-month wait, or what have you. And of course it's like night and day. The private treatment is, I would say, the private treatment is just as good as American treatment. It's absolutely world class. I mean, you can go to West London out toward Heathrow Airport and go into private hospitals out there, and well, you don't even have to go into the private hospital, just walk around the parking lot and just observe the cars and the nationalities, the skin colour of the people, all these Saudi Arabian princes and Middle Eastern leaders. They all get their doctoring done in West London. So that's world class.
With that, please join me in thanking John Blundell.